My name's Dr. Dave Beck, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Salford, and I teach social policy. And I've got the fantastic pleasure of introducing our keynote for this afternoon, Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham. Now we've got 20 minutes for Andy's discussion, because I'm sure Andy would also agree that it would be a great time to have 10 minutes to allow for question and answers from the audience. So if you do have any questions, please do enter them as well in the chat area, which our team will monitor. So Andy was elected Mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017, and he was re-elected for a second term in May 2021. Prior to being Mayor, Andy was the MP for Lee from 2001. And in government, Andy has held ministerial positions at the Home Office, Department of Health, and at the Treasury. And in 2008, he became Secretary of State for Culture, Media, Sport, before returning to Health as Secretary of State in 2009. Now, in opposition, Andy has served as Shadow Education Secretary and Shadow Health Secretary and Shadow Home Secretary. So it now gives me the great pleasure to welcome Andy Burnham, Mayor of Greater Manchester, to our discussion.
Thanks, Dave. In other words, I've never done a real job. Well, in fact, I have. I think the job I'm in now feels to me the job that's given me kind of most, if you like, in terms of insight, in terms of what we need to do to change Greater Manchester and the country, actually, to make it work better for people. So I just wanted to talk about that, and it's great to join you all again. I just want to, before I do, celebrate some of the progress that the network has made in the last year. It's great, isn't it, to see a pilot coming through in England. I think there's one in Ireland. Wales have a pilot focused on care leavers. So the kind of principle is becoming more and more accepted and is being tested. And I just think there's huge progress. And I know Fran, who is on the call today, Fran Darlington-Pollock, who leads up our Greater Manchester Mayor's charity and all of the related work on homelessness, recently did a roundtable with everybody to discuss the potential of a UBI pilot in Greater Manchester focused on homelessness, and we are very, very much still in the market for that if we can move that forward. So, you know, our intention to be a kind of template or a sort of a pilot area is very much as strong as it ever was, and obviously progress being made all of the while. But to get to what I wanted to say today, you know, as I've said, is I've been on my political journey, and those ministerial roles obviously have been important in shaping my thinking, but it only has been in this job, as I've looked at things from the bottom up, that I've realised how much change this country needs. And I think the national mood in the summer of 2023 is one of a growing feeling that things are broken, aren't they? The way we've run things has run its course. And that applies to the economic model, but also the social model as well. And I think we need a new economic model and a new social model as we go forward from here. And I think our job is to start to put into the mix the ideas that may bring those things through. Let me just say something about the economic model to begin with. The drive that we saw that began in the 80s and then was continued by all governments since, around, if you like, selling off the basics, privatizing the basics, has kind of left us in a pretty poor place, I would say. If you take the two examples of rail and water, you know, they are the two that are very much kind of front and center at the moment in terms of the evidence of failure, where you have the public paying high prices for both, much higher than people pay in the rest of Europe. You have a model that doesn't sort of take what people pay for those services and reinvest it into infrastructure. And that's true of rail, and it's true of water as well. So obviously we're seeing widespread closure of ticket offices on the rail side. We're seeing failure to invest in water infrastructure, leading to raw sewage in our rivers and our seas. But this is being done at the same time as dividends are being siphoned out of both of those sectors. So clearly, that model just does not work. It does not support the economy, but it doesn't, more importantly, support people. And I think people can see really clearly that economic model has run its course and is broken. But then if you then kind of turn to the social model, and it's related, of course, because it means that people are living through a severe cost of living crisis where the cost of the basics is high and people are struggling to afford the basics. And what we've seen emerge over the last 15 or so years is a kind of whole infrastructure in communities to, if you like, work around a failed social model, which is the sort of proliferation of food banks and food clubs and other initiatives to support people with the basics. I can remember when I was the Member of Parliament for Lee in 2011, 2012, when the first food banks really emerged in sort of number in my former constituency. I thought it'd be a 2-year thing, maybe a 3-year thing. Here we are, 13 years on, where across Greater Manchester, there's an entirely new infrastructure that's been built that is having to support people every day. And if that's not evidence of the failure of our social model, then I honestly don't know what is. And the question is, how long can that be sustained? Because it's often running on the goodwill of people, the kind of resilience of communities, and it's hard. But thank goodness we have so many good-hearted people in Greater Manchester who do commit to providing that support through our much-needed food banks and other initiatives. But you know, all of this is evidence of the failure of the way that we've done things, where we've left people in a position where they can't afford the basics, where the social model doesn't provide them with that funding. And the extent to which we are providing support, it's in many ways support that has to pick up crisis rather than supporting people when they actually need it. And I think we need to start thinking of a new social model that decisively shifts the burden of spending towards prevention. Colleagues who've heard me speak on these themes before will know that it was our work on homelessness that has really kind of shifted the way I've seen things with regard to, you know, if you set people up to succeed, the vast majority of people do succeed. You know, we've got incredible results from our Housing First scheme, and I can see Matt, who's on the call today, who's helped shape our work on that with us, and other colleagues from Greater Manchester. You know, we've got a scheme there that has achieved a tenancy success rate of around 80%, just short. And I think that's higher than anybody expected. But the learning from it is, and it's in many ways what people probably would have known anyway, but it nevertheless is what it's brought through, is that if you lift people out of the tyranny of the housing allocation rules and the benefit rules, and you give them breathing space and you set people up to succeed, the vast majority of people will succeed and they will turn things around and they will start to move forward again in life. To me, what I always saw when I was in the Westminster system is the Westminster system comes at things from the opposite point of view. They sort of buy the rhetoric often of the right-wing press that is all about kind of punitive language, a divisive language about benefits, you know, dividing people into shirkers and workers or strivers and skivers and all of that sort of nonsense. And they frame a system around kind of distrust of people, you know, a kind of entire system based around kind of sanctions, initiatives and tests to sort of find people out, because there's an assumption that everybody is trying to kind of play the system in one way or another. And the truth is, they spend a whole load of money trying to trip people up than actually in spending money to set people up to succeed. And it's why I kind of say that I think we need a sort of complete paradigm shift, really, in terms of the economic model and the social model, if we're to put this country back on a path that's a good path for the majority of people. So this is where, you know, my thinking is in terms of what I think we need to do to point a way forward. And the opportunity comes, of course, with the change that we all need to make to the basics, to housing, to energy systems, to transport, with regard to climate. So obviously we're also living through a moment here where we can see the reality of climate change around us. And we know that this isn't sort of something that we could or should put off forever. We need now to face up to a new way of thinking, a new way of working. If we're going to spend significant sums of money changing our energy systems, changing housing, changing transport to meet our climate obligations as we should do it through a new economic model, which is much more about public ownership of the essentials, community ownership, cooperative ownership, so that we have an economic model that makes the essentials affordable to people, but also ensures the wealth created from those industries is kept within communities. But then secondly, I think alongside that, we need to start thinking about a different social model. Personally, I believe the requirement to retrofit homes gives us an opportunity to create a much broader home improvement program. And I do think we need to think about basic income alongside a good home. And the two things to me are sort of are going together. If we're going to set people up to succeed, it's not just the income that they have. It is the home as well that they have to live in. And actually, if you want evidence of some of the greatest kind of evidence of failure and a broken market, well, you only have to look at the housing market. When you have a situation here in Greater Manchester where a 2-year-old boy is killed because of the poor condition of his home, then you know you have an utterly broken system. So I think we need to talk about housing as a human right, guarantee in UK law a good home, a secure home for everybody. And I do think that is one of the foundations of a new economic model and a new social model. But then beyond that, I think you can start thinking about a different way of supporting people and ensuring that we are paying for success rather than failure. I come back to that central finding from Housing First. Set people up to succeed, and they will. So if you invest in that way, if you follow that principle, I think we've got to demonstrate through the various pilots that are ongoing that it is actually a better way of using public funds to start to support people with the money that they need to live a good life, to feed their kids, to live without the worry of constantly wondering if they're going to have enough to pay the rent and pay for the food. If you lifted people out of that worry by having a form of basic income, the evidence I've got that you could prevent a whole number of depressive disorders. They could be prevented or mitigated or postponed. Between 125,000 and a million cases. You can look at the health benefits of a basic income across the board. They would be huge in terms of physical health and mental health. If we're running a crisis social model in the 21st century, I think at some point it will collapse. We're seeing in the NHS at the moment a kind of the old thinking playing out where we're kind of not supporting people in their homes, not supporting people in their communities. And then that pressure builds year on year on year in the NHS. And there is only so long that you can go on with that before the system falls over. I think if you set people up with a good home and a decent income, I personally believe the burden of public spending in the 21st century will be sustainable. And we'll be using what we do put into support people to much better effect than we are at this moment in time, paying for good lives rather than paying to mitigate the effects of crisis. So that's the way it kind of looks from my point of view right now. I think we've got to put into the public realm kind of big ideas that will shape things as we move forward. I think there is actually a kind of growing consensus across political parties that things are pretty broken. I just don't think as of yet the ideas have emerged that have got that broad consensus. So that's our next challenge, isn't it? To show that there is a different and a better way of doing things. If you kind of go down the path of, just, if you like, cutting benefits, freezing benefits, running that sort of punitive rhetoric about benefits, othering people on benefits, in the end, what that does is it creates costs in other parts of the system that are often invisible to people in Westminster. It was revealing to me to arrive in the Greater Manchester system and see how, when Westminster freezes local housing allowance, for instance, it creates unfunded pressures on local authorities to find temporary accommodation or bed and breakfast accommodation for families made homeless. And it's a classic example there of kind of a very poor, short-sighted approach to public spending that really needs to be challenged. Kind of that Westminster kind of tendency to follow what the newspapers say or come up with things that please them actually has real consequences on the ground. And I don't honestly know how much longer councils can kind of live in a world like this, where they're kind of picking up the pieces from some of those kind of short-sighted decisions in Westminster. The time has come for a fundamental rethink of how we do these things. I've got 1 minute. Is that one, Dave? It looks like it's a very squiggly one. 2! Oh, you were so generous, Dave. I mean, God, you're spoiling me this afternoon. I'll make it 1 anyway, so that I don't overspeak. I think there's massive appetite, I think, certainly for a new economic model. I think voters of all parties will say the big privatization experiment of the utilities has evidently failed. So can we go from there now and start to talk about both a new economic model with different forms of ownership as we rebuild society to meet the climate challenge, and alongside it, a new social model that sets people up for success? I think we can. The evidence supports us. So let's get on and do it. And we'll finish there, Dave, and hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. That was wonderful. I've made lots of notes. But I would like to open the floor to people who've taken the time to come and join us today. Our first question comes from Phil Jackson. I wonder if Phil would like to unmute and ask his question.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Phil.
All right. Sorry, just a sec. Yeah. Yeah. Question: why is automation a problem to begin with? Like, why on earth is labor-saving technology treated as like an existential threat? How do we turn labor-saving technology into a problem? I feel like every economist on earth should just be like studying this question very, very carefully, because something is very, very broken if something is obviously good as machines doing things for us is creating scarcity instead of abundance.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. It's a big one. I'll have a go at it. I think it all depends upon the policy purpose to which the technology is set, I would say. And I think it does point back to what I was saying about a new economic model and a new social model. If we take AI and other labor-saving technology and say, the societal purpose and the economic purpose will be to improve everybody's life and give everybody a better work-life balance, then I think the technology could help to do that. If we go with the way we currently run things, where really large corporations rush ahead with this technology in a quite unregulated space, there's a fair chance that it won't do that, and it could actually widen inequality and increase the kind of the wealth of a small percentage of people at the expense of many others. So the question is, the answer to what you're saying, Phil, is are governments around the world going to be bold enough to make sure that there is a if you like, a common goal around to the wide societal benefits of harnessing this technology, or are we going to carry on with a kind of sense of big corporations almost can do what they like? It's an unregulated space, and I think that could lead us to a very difficult and dark place. So it's a big question, but it almost points the need for new thinking about our economy and our society. Maybe it forces us to address those questions.
Thanks very much for that. Thanks, Phil, for your question as well. So there's been a comment in the chat as well about reading Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber to answer some of the questions around automation as well.
Oh, I thought you were talking about mine for a minute then. Thank God for that. It's a title of a book, is it?
Yeah, by David Graeber. So next, we've also got a question from Paul from the University of Birmingham, a UCU member as well.
Hi, thanks, Andy. It's really interesting to get to hear you talk on this. The question I had was, do you think the outcomes of pilots and trials in the UK, like the Welsh care leaver trial, have scope to sort of shift that relationship of the Labour Party to UBI as a policy and sort of move it away from that shirker-striver language? And sort of as a sub point to that, how successful do you think the trials need to be to get that sort of shift?
I think they can, Paul, for certain. And I do think our Housing First results, and I know they're pretty similar in Liverpool and the West Midlands, can't be ignored, can they? They can't be ignored, because we've achieved a higher success rate than anybody thought we would. And I think, it speaks to a sort of truth, doesn't it, that the majority of people will do what we would hope they would, which is to sort of get their lives back on track if they're given that support without all of the cliff edges and the conditions that often come with the system. I think there's just a sort of whole change that's needed here. And I think it's when the evidence stacks up about it costs less to do it this way than it does to do it that way, then I think the debate can be won. So I do think this approach of piloting and showing and telling through the results of the pilots is the way to go, because there is such an ingrained sort of thinking about these things in the sort of Whitehall world that can't be shifted overnight. But I do think the idea of, that's why I really support UBI Lab Network. It's all about gathering that evidence from here, isn't it, but around the world, to say, look, there's a very different and better way of doing things. And I kind of feel it's almost back to Phil's question, such is the uncertainty of 21st century living that we are going to have to set people up with firmer foundations, aren't we, than have had to be provided before, just because of the way life is changing and how difficult it's becoming. And I do think it requires a rethinking of the welfare state. And I think it is all about gathering that evidence to show that actually, if you do it this way, it becomes more affordable as a country to do it this way rather than another way.
Thanks for that. Thanks very much for your question as well, Paul. Wonderful question. So we are coming to the end, but as chair's privilege, I'm going to ask one final question to Andy. So considering all the discussions and the discussion you just had as well with Paul, but considering the discussions from the earlier sessions today, we've heard from world leading experts on basic income, talking about inequality, talking about trade unions and pilots, and this idea of pilots. So since we've seen like the impact of pilots from around the world and very, very locally in Wales as well. Wales has got an equivalent population of Greater Manchester, around about 3 million each. We've also got 2 pilots happening in England as well. So is there an opportunity for a Greater Manchester-based pilot?
Yeah, for sure. I mentioned the work that Fran had done, and Fran's on the call, and maybe Fran can pick some of the feedback from all of that work she's been doing and share it with the group later. So for us, if we could build out our Housing First scheme into something more permanent and something bigger, I think we would love to do that, and that could be a natural pilot for us. One thought I would say, though, maybe we need to kind of start thinking about what could an England pilot look like, you know, if Wales have gone with care leavers, I think that's a really good suggestion. Here, I'm trying to think of something that would capture broad public support. A group I would look at would be unpaid family carers. I think there would be a very strong case for giving unpaid family carers a basic income to make their lives manageable in a way that they're often not at the moment. Because it's clear the public would understand why they might be prioritised, because they are in effect providing a public service, aren't they? And if they weren't there, or they can't sustain what they're doing anymore, that will have consequences for social care, for councils, but particularly for the NHS. And you know, because obviously the carers' benefits aren't sufficient, are they, for people who've had to stop work? And you know, life can become really hard, particularly when people are paying social care charges to supplement what they're doing. And I just think this lab network probably should start thinking about, well, and bear in mind public opinion, because you do have to bear in mind public opinion, Dave, and what is kind of, where could a consensus be formed. I think in my career as a politician, I've often heard voters of all parties say, oh, carers should be getting some form of a wage. You know, if you're going to do that, it's a really hard thing to do. And, you know, they deserve better support than what they get. And I think I think amongst voters of all parties, there's a kind of consensus around that. I just think that's the way to build this, I think, you know, kind of think about establishing support for a group that the majority of people would say it's really important to support that group of people, and then to allow them, give them enough stability in their life to do what they need to do. And then you can demonstrate why there's wider societal benefits for everybody from working in that way, rather than them being set up to fail, as I was saying before, and they can't continue looking after their loved one, and then the extra costs kind of rack up in a different way. So I don't know, I'm just giving you a kind of an idea there. We definitely would take a sort of pilot in GM based around homelessness for sure. But I also, and there's other things, isn't there? I think Paul's putting one in the chat there. I've given you one example, but there could be others. And I think that's how UBI probably needs to build, I think. Or it could be, you know, parents of children with special educational needs, or, you know, we could think through, couldn't we, how you might do that, and where we think we could, you know, and I think we do need to think about maximising public buy-in and public support for how we're trying to build this concept. But you know, I hope some of what I've said today has resonated. I'm really glad to be with you all again. Keep up the good work. And I'll hand back again to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andy. So just for people who've just been listening who may not be aware of who the UBI Lab network is that Andy was talking about then, if you Google the UBI Lab network, you can find us online. You can join your local group, or you can start a group based on basic income. So we're probably going to be contacting Andy and taking his ideas further again. But I'd like to just say once again, thank you very much for joining us again.
No worries.
Thank you very much. It's great to catch up with you again on your thoughts.
I've got to go back to saving ticket offices now. So thanks for giving me a little break.
Fantastic.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Thank you.